Let me then start. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm Smita Mishra, founder and CEO of Pandoro Technologies. We are a consulting team powered by a platform that empowers enterprises to be planet positive by helping them identify and manage their sustainability-related goals, risks, and opportunities using the SDG framework. We support our clients with bespoke consulting services and offer remote sustainability team support in case they have limited or no teams to work dedicatedly on their sustainability roadmap. I welcome you all to this edition of the Imagine webinar. Imagine was created as a forum for discussion to engage with the business leaders, the investors, and entrepreneurs across the globe to help us imagine the future and be creative about generating opportunities and solving challenges. Our speakers have in past included CXOs, investors, thought leaders, academicians, and who have actually helped us navigate through these difficult times and identify opportunities in a fast-changing world. A growing topic of interest and debate is around the SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals and their role in investing. And given the growing questions on this topic, we are holding a series of webinars on this topic to discuss and debate the various viewpoints. Today is the third in this series of investing through the SDG lens. The topic today, which is responsible investments and sustainability, quote unquote SDGs, explores the current and upcoming policies and practices in the space of private funding through towards sustainable development. We will hear from our panelists how more and more investments are working with for-profit startups and are adopting sustainability. Before we introduce our esteemed panelists, a brief about IBCAP Ventures, which is also the organizing team for this webinar. This VC fund was founded in 2011 with a vision to leverage global alumni ecosystems to foster entrepreneurship in India and identify and invest in high-growth businesses with entrepreneurs with the potential to be market leaders. In 2015, we launched IBCamp, India's first unified innovation and entrepreneurship platform that leverages our global alumni networks to work with, create value for, and help grow early stage entrepreneurs. We've created a network of domain experts, investors, incubators, corporates, and entrepreneurs that we work with, and we regularly conduct engagements and corporate innovation programs. Now, a couple of points on the logistics. The discussion is going to be about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we're going to open the floor for Q&A with the audience. Please submit your questions through the chat with your names, and we will raise them up with the panelists. If you would like to speak to a particular panelist, feel free to mention that. We would also love to have this webinar very interactive, so and useful and meaningful to you. So please do put forth your thoughts and your questions. With that as the background, let's start with the discussion today with our esteemed panelists. Today, joining us on the panel are Smita Rakesh, who leads the Clean Energy and Clean Action portfolios at Social Alpha. Priscilla Burdai, is that the right way? How do you say your name?
Boyardi, but it's okay.
Okay. So Priscilla Boyardi, who is a policy analyst on private funding for sustainable development at OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and Ruchi Hanasoge, who is the senior manager on the strategy and impact team at Omidyar Network India and is responsible for the portfolio's impact. So very warm welcome, Smita, Priscilla, and Ruchi. It will be great to start with a quick round of introduction from you, and maybe let me start with you, Priscilla. Tell us more about you and your role, and also about the role of OECD.
Thank you so much, Smita, and thanks also for the invitation. It's great to have the opportunity to present with such a great panel of all women. I'm really happy to see this happen. So yes, as you said, my name is Priscilla Boyardi. I work at the OECD, and more specifically, I'm part of the Private Finance for Sustainable Development team, which is part of the Development Cooperation Directorate. So what we do is to help donors and governments find new ways to work with the private sector, to push for the private sector to be more engaged in the Agenda 2030 and in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So the reason why we work on this at the OECD is really this understanding, this recognition that, you know, the limited budgets of governments to face the COVID pandemic, to face the growing inequalities, cannot alone be achieving the SDGs. We really need more and more engagement of the private sector in giving resources for the sustainable development goals. And you know that there was a 2.5 trillion USD funding gap before the pandemic. We are now talking about a probable 4.2 trillion US dollar funding gap for the SDGs. So the challenge is enormous. The challenge is really big. And what can we do? So as the OECD, we really try to support, as I said, private investors and also corporates in understanding better what they can do to channel their resources through for the Sustainable Development Agenda. But we also try to provide evidence in terms of what are the different policies and what are the different approaches that work best in the different contexts. So for different sectors or for different countries. We also try to push the public and private stakeholders to be more accountable for the impact they generate, whether it's positive, but also when it's negative. So we really push them to be more transparent and to be more accountable. So really this role of the OECD is defined in many different ways, and we try to influence not just the policymakers, but also the private sector. And I'm happy to tell the audience more about the work we do, perhaps a bit later in more detail. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, Prishla. Thank you so much. I so agree with you. And I mean, firstly, thanks for being here. But yes, bringing in the perspective that so much of hard work that we had put in for last couple of decades is probably getting pushed back now with the pandemic there. So I think we need more focus and more work to be done in this space. So coming to you, Smita, please share a quick introduction of yours and your team Social Alpha in terms of what is your investment thesis and how is this space coming up for you, the climate tech and clean energy in India and globally?
Sure, thank you. And I second Priscilla on the fact that it's such a pleasure to be on an all-women panel. Rarely the sight, but you know, so motivating. So Social Alpha, like you know, you've introduced, we are a not-for-profit, but it's more of a mission to drive economic growth, social justice, and climate action. And with those three, you know, larger objectives, it was set up a little over 5 years ago. We work closely with startups, you know, startups which have science and technology solutions at the core primarily. And the idea is why those startups? Because we realize that that's where the risks are the highest, and that's where you know, investor confidence into early stage startup is the lowest, right? So the risk reward ratios are not in the favor of these startups to raise funds, and which is why Social Alpha comes in at a very early stage, primarily looking at product based science and technology based startups. We work across sectors, you know, medtech, assistive technologies, which is technologies for people with disabilities, urban tech, clean energy, of course, climate resilient agriculture, water sanitation, and you know, so many other impact areas. I lead the work on clean energy and climate action. And within climate action, we look at you know, clean energy and renewables. We look at sustainable habitat, sustainable mobility, you know, like I said, civic tech and waste management solutions primarily, and also climate resilient agriculture, pollution, public health, which gets impacted by the impact of climate action. And we also look at, you know, focusing within climate action, we look at not just the mitigation-based solutions, but also the adaptation-based solutions. So working closely with farmers on the ground, which we all know are, you know, the primary, most vulnerable communities and the first to get affected, right? Geographies which are very vulnerable, so and underserved, right? So so at Social Alpha, you know, we keep debating. We are thesis driven, like all investors are, but our thesis tries to cover blind spots in the sector, and we keep saying that, you know, our money comes with an opportunity cost, because you know, we come with a not-for-profit intent, but and you know, a philanthropic intent, but we come with the business model of an investor. So without calling ourselves impact investors, so to say, we still come in at a very early stage with smaller ticket sizes, but the idea is to look at the blind spots where other maybe sector players are sort of not taking the risk or missing the sort of problem. Second, be very, very sure on financially supporting, but as well as realizing that startups need more than just finance. And that also cannot be a cookie cutter kind of support. So we also are incubators. We run incubators which provide very customized support to startups. But with these two basic principles, we try and focus on a number of impact areas. And like I said, I lead the work on clean energy and climate action. I'll share more on some of the principles maybe later, Smita.
Wow, that's a lot of good work, and I am so glad to have you here. Welcome. Yeah. All right. So thanks, Smita. And coming to you, Ruchi, kindly do introduce yourself and your team, Omidyar Network India, for the audience, and also share your investment thesis.
Sure. So I'd like to echo Priscilla and Smita. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm really excited to hear the perspectives that, the panelists have, and then also engage with the audience, and learn from their perspectives. So a little bit about, perhaps I'll start with Omidyar Network India and then describe my role. So Omidyar Network India is an impact investing firm focused, we say our brand purpose is about investing in bold entrepreneurs who help create a meaningful life for every Indian. So we are a firm that is funded solely with the philanthropic capital of Pam and Pierre Omidyar. Pierre Omidyar, as some of you may know, is the founder of eBay. And since 2008, we've been investing in India, and we've invested over $320 million in over 120 organizations that cumulatively have reached over 550 million lives. So at the highest level, ON's investment thesis, like I said, we want to create a more meaningful life for every Indian. And we narrow this down further by trying to serve a population that we call the next 500 million. So these are the 500 million or so Indians who will come online for the first time between 2018 and 2022 using a smartphone. And we think that this group mainly falls within the bottom 60% of India's income pyramid, i.e. this is households earning less than 21,000 rupees per month. So given that we have this target customer in mind, we invest in 8 defined sectors. We have education, financial inclusion, emerging technology, which is a large umbrella term that encompasses ag tech, health tech, etc., governance and citizen engagement, property rights, and digital society. And then we also have the next 2 portfolios are on what we call open data ecosystems and non-profit ecosystem development. So given that we are extremely sector-led, what I do is I am the senior manager on the strategy and impact team. So we take a very strong impact-oriented lens throughout the investment process. At the outset, we have a strategic fit discussion when a deal is first considered by an investment team, long before it is brought to an investment committee for a decision. So for all our investments, we will consider the alignment with the firm's strategy, with our sector-led initiative strategies, sector-focused initiative strategies. And then we will also consider the impact on the next 500 million. This is a really important frame for us, and all our portfolio organizations must have a pathway to impact the NHB. We also follow a dual checkbook model in that we make equity investments in for-profit companies, and we also give grants to non-profit organizations. And we do this because what we're trying to do is really create large-scale sector-wide impact. And we feel that it is important to actively try to influence the sector as opposed to only making direct investments, which might be a slower process to impact.
Wow. Again, another good team doing a lot of good work. So I'm so wanting to come to you, Priscilla, for a lot of discussion on policy. But before I do that, I really want to go back to you, Smita, you and Ruchi, because you're leading investment teams. You are actually helping build those solutions that we are looking forward to as the global citizens. We are looking forward to those solutions to somehow help reduce our GHG emissions, maybe help us have cleaner air, better living conditions, and in different areas. So I want to just quickly, and there are quite a few attendees, I'm sure, who are here right now who would be looking at you with that understanding as to how do these people really invest, how do these people measure. So I kind of have a fair idea now as to what are the different areas you invest in and how you are looking at different, what is your bigger goal behind in making your investments. But let me quickly also ask you, how do you really measure the performance of your investment? And do SDGs have a role to play in your work? And while I see a lot of investors talking about ESGs, we are still seeing a growing number of people talk about SDGs, but there are already quite a few people now who are talking about ESG. So ESG versus SDG, what is your take? So tell me about how you measure your performance and if SDGs have a role to play in ESG versus SDG. Yeah. Smita, you can go first.
Sure. Also, I just realized that in trying to be brief, I missed a part of your earlier question. So maybe I'll start with that and then come to it if that's okay, Smita. Great, thanks. So you were asking me how is the climate and clean energy, that space sort of shaping up, and we've been seeing, and I'll try and be brief, but we've been seeing that the space has been attracting a lot of investment over the last decade or so, or more actually. But there's this IEA report which basically said that how investments had dipped by 30% in 2020 in the clean energy, clean tech space broadly, and that is owing to two reasons, right? One is because there was some the divergence of investment and into health based solutions, which were a priority, but also because of the uncertainty in the market, right? So that there's been some dip. But we also realize that within climate and clean energy, there's a lot that's at very, very early stages. And, apparently there's some 50% of impact potential that has been studied to be in very early stage startups or, very early stage technologies that haven't reached the market yet. And therefore, the role that some of us will have to play with a very, clear vision of the future and knowing that, we'll have to drive that impact in the future is going to be very strong. But we are seeing more systemic changes happening in some of the sectors. Coming to your other question around where do SDGs feature? They definitely impact is at the core of our investing decision. Innovation and impact are two very, very core areas. We look at the problem thesis fit and we look at the innovation play there, because these are historically unsolved problems. These are historically under-created markets, right? So we need to look at innovative ways of addressing it, because realizing that, it's only science and technology-based solutions that can sort of, with obviously business model and delivery model innovation as well, but the way science and technology can trigger a change, and especially because we are running behind time when it comes to climate action, right? It's not like we have little time, we're actually out of time. So SDGs are important. We actually work on aspects of all 17 SDGs across our themes, but how we've embedded it is by a couple of things. And I'll break this into two things. One is this whole process of selection. And I think when there is early targeting and when there is an impact understanding into the thesis and selection of enterprises to invest into, the measurement and tracking part comes more naturally and more sort of automatically into the process, and that becomes easier. Because at the end of the day, we don't want to start with just having our pick in terms of market returns and then sort of look at impact as an afterthought, and which in many cases happens to startups, and that's where they feel burdened to now report on certain impact areas which they hadn't earlier signed up for, right? They never sort of promised an impact goal that the investor or the funder is now demanding from them. So the idea is to embed it as early as possible in the process. And so we look at 4 lenses, which are our guiding lenses for impact. One is sustainability and climate. The other is health and wellness. The third is livelihoods and prosperity. And fourth is inclusion and gender. So all these 4 together essentially are cornerstones. So not every startup is going to have an impact on these, but an assessment around these 4 can tell us if there is a negative impact that an enterprise is having, or if it is having an impact, a strong impact on 2 or more of these lenses, then it's a very strong case of not just climate goals being achieved, but also looking at livelihoods or serving the underserved communities. At the same time, what I wanted to share was the theory of change has to be very, very strong, and it has to be very enterprise or problem statement area specific. So if we are intervening, for example, in an area where we are not creating avenues for gender impact at the time of designing the interventions or at the time of choosing the startups, we cannot hope for it as a good to have thing. And there are cases where startups have their own journeys where they go above and beyond the mandate and actually achieve that. But that's not an expectation that we can set out as investors with. So the idea is to build it very strongly in the theory of change. What we try and practice is ensuring that we have a very strongly edged out theory of change for different problem statement areas. So in electric mobility, for example, we'll look at it differently, right? The focus is going to be more towards climate impact and what are the economics which can drive the change. But if you're looking at energy access based solutions, which are at the core of the work that we do in clean energy, then you have to consider how is it enhancing livelihoods and productive applications at the grassroots. How is it leveling the inclusion has to be there, right? Because you then cannot look at just the low hanging fruits per market. So it's very customized for every problem statement, I would say, the theory of change, but it's also very realistic and has to be co-designed with the enterprises that you're working with, has to be set early on and cannot be a burden on the enterprise to report back to you on and achieve. And yeah, finally, I just wanted to share that there are two things. One is just mapping of these very granular impact that every enterprise's pathway is going to give you. But the second is also understanding the systems lens. With the systems lens, what is changing and how is it that we are going to be a part of that story. So what we did, and fortunately for us, we got there is expertise required to do all of that, right? As investors, we don't always know all of it. We can't, a lot of these solutions haven't shown any impact so far. So, and these technologies are new. So you've got to be very embedded into the changing landscape to understand whether it will have an impact or not. So we managed to embed a very strong framework with the help of experts and partners, International Energy Agency, I was mentioning them earlier, RISE Institute, Sweden, and some of the other partners who are helping us do a very strong and rigorous assessment where we can calculate the potential impact in terms of climate goals, in terms of, their lock-in into the current resource intensive systems, and whether these solutions are furthering and accelerating a systems change, or are they just incremental solutions, maybe making no difference. And there is a trade-off. Not all solutions are going to be moving from the current systems to new systems, but we have to acknowledge what is it that is required during this transition period, and is probably a solution that is furthering it, and have the goals, impact goals, measurements around it. But we also have to know that there are some solutions that we'll have to invest into for the longer haul, where we can't expect immediate revenues and exit horizons. And on your question around ESG and SDG, I don't think it's a versus situation. I think ESGs are just a manifestation or implications of the SDGs, and is the way to go.
Excellent, Smita. Awesome. You just earned a fan in me. Yeah, I think you said it very rightly. And just so a lot of people, while we're talking about SDGs and implementing them, I think that is more like an umbrella, a framework that you could look at. But the kind of research that you are doing, let's say with IEA or any other team, that is very critical for the landscape of your work, because otherwise, even if you showcase something on SDGs, you may probably not be doing justice to your real metrics and real impact that you could be creating. So excellent approach, Smita, and good work there.
Yeah. Thanks. Sorry, just to add, I'm very conscious of not, which is why I'm rushing through this, but one quick thing, exactly what you said, Smita. If it's not done early on, then it's always going to be more of a retrospective projection of this is the impact we have achieved. We are not here to sing our success stories. We are here to drive those. And therefore, it's very important that we build it in our vision and not in our patting our back exercises.
No, you're right there. We actually see investors now, because my job is to work with investors and their portfolio to help them adopt sustainability. I see how difficult it is for these people to consider the budgets and efforts as an afterthought. It becomes an overhead for them. Coming to you, Ruchi, very quickly. So how does ONI work towards this? Like, what is your way of selection, and how do you measure them? And is there any approach that you have which aligns with the SDGs? Yeah. You are on mute, Ruchi.
As I mentioned, because we're sector driven, the investment thesis and the specific metrics around each investment is a key discussion for us before we make the investment decision and at any follow-on funding decisions. So once the investment committee approves the investment, our strategy and impact team, that is my team and the investment team, we typically sit down and we'll co-create the impact measurement and management plan, or the IMM plan, for the organization. So this includes, we track 6 metrics at the portfolio level, because it's important for us to be able to at least say, what is the change that we are able to see that our portfolio companies are being able to drive. But we also look at each investment uniquely. So for an education investment, there may be some metrics that will be helpful for our investment leads to monitor the progress of the business, and for the entrepreneurs themselves to help understand what's working well, what's not going well. And then we conduct impact reviews throughout the life cycle of the investment. So if investment leads, of course, do this typically on a monthly basis. And then we look at, at a portfolio-wide level, we look at it on a quarterly basis. So the 6 metrics that we measure across the portfolio are at 2 levels. One is direct impact, which is the impact of the products and services themselves on the beneficiaries. And there are 3 metrics we track within this. One is just reach, how many people have you served? 2 is depth, where we say, look, what is the quality of life improvement that is occurring as a result of this product or service? And 3, similar to what Smita mentioned, is inclusion, where we are trying to say, what is the socioeconomic status of these end customers or beneficiaries? Because this goes back to our overarching investment thesis of trying to serve the bottom 60% of India's income pyramid. So on depth and inclusion, we've typically done this through end customer surveys, and we work with external organizations who help us do this. And then the next 3 metrics fall under what we call sector impact. So like I mentioned earlier, sector impact is very important for us. It's often harder to measure because it's more nebulous, and it's not as easy as just asking a company for data. But the way we do it is that, one, we measure the number of imitators that we think our investees have created. So we think, because we invest in nascent and catalytic areas, we think that initial pioneers or initially pioneering models can spark changes in the way business is done. So a large incumbent bank can perhaps start offering a product or service catering to low-income customers. Or you may have product innovation in itself. So we measure the number of imitators. We then also measure the follow-on capital that is raised by our investees, because what we're trying to see is, look, are we able to attract more mainstream funding into these areas? Like I said, we're an impact investor. We're funded by philanthropic capital. And so social impact, our model requires us to have social impact and financial return. But as Smita was mentioning, right, we are able to take on some of these early risks because we are not a traditional investor, right? But if you're able to attract mainstream investors, we believe that that is a sign of having sector impact. And then the last thing that we measure is contribution to impactful policies. So can we actually change or reform policies at the government level? So quickly on your other question on SDGs. So, because we have an impact first outlook and we only invest in these 8 defined sectors, which link very closely with the SDG framework, we have not yet formally linked our investments to, the 17 SDGs. But in some ways, we think that our investment philosophy actually goes beyond the standard SDG framework. So internally, we say we're SDG plus, because one, we have these very specific investment theses for each of the 8 sectors. Again, similar to what Smita mentioned, there is a problem statement where we say, look, within education, these are the 4 subsectors in which we think, this is where the sector is headed, and this is where we think we could have maximal impact. And then the second thing is that we have a strong impact measurement and management practice, which helps us actually track our progress, not just at the investment level, but we also look at the sector as a whole. So, we say, look, how is education in India actually trending? So we look at third-party reports such as ASAR, etc., to help us do this. On ESG versus SDG, so ESG, I think, has become very important now. It's starting to become more and more mainstream. And because more mainstream investors are starting to take this responsible lens or a do no harm lens. So we think ESG is a good way for us to think about the potential harms or the risks that may arise from an investment. So because again, we've been strategy driven, we have always assessed our investments on their social and their corporate governance practices. And we've helped our investors then mitigate these wherever we've seen that there may be a potential red flag. Historically, we have actually not considered the environmental aspect of our investments. Also because, we've mostly been a more traditional VC type player investing in tech-led investments. But as of last month, we have started to add this to our list of diligence questions where we're saying, look, if we're investing in a mobility solution, what is the environmental impact, right? And how can we help offset these in some ways if necessary?
Brilliant work there again, Ruchi. Very, very nice to hear all of this. So I'm going to now come to you, Priscilla. I have a very specific question around policies. I was just reading recently that ESG assets may hit $53 trillion by 2025, which would mean that almost a third of the global assets under management are going to be sustainability related, like they're going to be associated with it. But if I were to quote the view of some of the practitioners and observers in this space, and a view that I also share, personally, I share the same too, is that despite this exhilarating market response that we are often we see in corporate participation and actions, we find that they still fall short on both commitment and output, which is invariably linked to their inability to integrate sustainable business practices into their corporate strategy. Now, both investors and corporates are argued to face roadblocks in thoughts and direction to further their capital utilization for impactful societal and environmental changes. So while ESG investing did pave the way for accelerated, I would say, market transformations and for the better, a tangible gap has been noted that there is between the potential investment opportunities and their realization. So while I also see that the sustainability assets under management are growing, so every day there's a new number which is coming up that so much more has been put towards that. I'm not quite sure I see the impact in the same, with the same velocity or with the same impact in the same, at least in the same graph. I see that, okay, it's growing with the same similar correlation. And also, I feel that while ESGs were there, and I feel that SDGs are being a better anchor, and for the lack of better term, I can say they're more, I may just say that SDGs, though they're being more thematic than corporate centric, they can help in aligning these sector and company or investor specific ESG factors with broader societal and environmental goals. Now, looking at this gap of how much investments are happening, but the kind of realization and output that's coming, what do you think? What would you like to suggest to these private funding people, who, whether they are individuals, investors, institutional investors, VCs, DFIs, whoever are behind these funds who are actually funding the sustainable development? What do you suggest? How can they actually close this gap? And if there are any policies, guidelines, standards that you would like to suggest for them to follow?
Many thanks, Smita, for the question. And also, it's very, very nice to see the work of Ruchi and Smita. I think, even Smita, if you don't define yourself as an impact investor, I would say that you definitely are. And this is based on the fact that you intentionally target positive, sustainable impact. I think that's the biggest proof. And this is linked to your question, Smita, around this issue between ESG funds being so forthcoming, so present. We see them everywhere, but we can't really see the actual outcomes in the improvement of life of people and the planet. And we did some research at the OECD in the finance directorate actually on what's inside this ESG funds, especially looking at the ESG ratings. And it's incredible, and it's quite interesting to see how the issue at the end of the day is in how you define the sustainability and how you define and fund as being ESG. Unfortunately, as of today, we have an enormous amount of different ESG ratings that rate investments and investors and funds according to completely different criteria that are, the research of the OECD shows that if you look at the correlation of these ratings, it's in the realm of, I think, 0.3, 0.4, which is a very low correlation. This means that the same fund can be rated as a very high compliant to ESG through one rating and very low compliant to another rating. So I think this is the first problem that we need to tackle. You have a number of funds that claim to be sustainability funds, but in fact, the only thing they do at best is not looking at sustainability in terms of maximization of positive outcomes on people and the planet, but in terms of minimization of the potential environmental risks, not even social, but mostly just environmental risks that are material to the financial performance of the business. So it's really very specific, and sometimes the same fund can decide to flag that it's rated through a certain rating system, because that gives it a better, let's say, face value to potential investors. The other issue that we see is that very often investors, let's say institutional investors, don't have the time to put in looking at what's exactly inside this ESG rating. So often if you unpack this ESG rating, you find that since it's an average, let's say, score that it's given, maybe an organization, a fund, sorry, it's doing very, very well on a certain aspect, but it's doing very, very badly on certain other aspects that unfortunately very often are the social ones. Or it's not even reporting on those, but since it's an average, in the end, everything goes in the same pot. And I think that's also a very important issue that we are seeing that the regulators are starting to look at. And more specifically, I'm thinking about the newly launched regulation at European level. The European Commission recently launched the EU green taxonomy. So they are trying to categorize activities depending on their level of green, let's say. And they instituted a certain number of categorizations that allow really to see whether a certain financial product is green or not. And they're also thinking now about a social taxonomy. And regardless of what this social taxonomy will look like, I think what's interesting is that regulators are starting to notice these issues in the market, and they're starting to push the market more towards being more transparent and more accountable, because the issue is not what you have in your fund. The issue is how you label your fund. So I think this is the most important thing regulators can do, is really push for more transparency towards the users of these funds, which are either institutional investors or, on the other side, even the greater public. We have the right to know what's in these funds and to make decisions. Because at the end of the day, the worst thing that can happen, I think, to the global sustainability movement is that the concept is completely diluted to the point that we lose integrity and we are basically losing the battle, let's say. And the other thing is, while the regulator is moving, we are also seeing a number of companies, traditional enterprises, not just social enterprises, but more and more traditional enterprises and traditional investors move and start to understand that maybe just stopping at financial materiality, it's not enough. I mean, I don't need to tell you what's going on around the world in terms of environmental crisis, and also for many aspects, there are a lot of social issues that are linked to this environmental crisis. So what we observe, especially when it comes to development cooperation, because we work a lot with developing countries, is that companies are starting to think for themselves what we can do before new regulation comes, also outside of the European Union, to prevent, to sort of take a step forward. And they're learning a lot from organizations like Omidyar Network and also the organizations that Smita is representing. They're really, from Social Alpha, they're really learning from the practices of impact investing. And what they're seeing and what they're understanding is that metrics, having a number that you track, it's an interesting thing, and probably the regulator is going to ask it, and it's great to have. But what really matters is how you're organized internally. How do you change the internal incentives of your company, which can be an enterprise or an investment company, so that the whole organization is thinking about this environmental social issue in a way that is not just a box ticking exercise, or as when I was studying back in the days, I remember you had this CSR function, which was this poor guy at the end of his career in a little corner, in a small office, just filling in the CSR report once a year that was presented like, a side thing before his retirement. They really want this culture to permeate the whole organization. And I think there are now more and more tools that empower these organizations to do it. With the UNDP, for example, we've developed these impact standards for financing sustainable development, which we launched at the end of May. And this is just, standards are a clear example of how you can support organizations in going through this journey by showing them that the SDGs are there, they are the guide. And it's great that you keep in mind what are the big issues. They flag, they point to what are the issues that we're trying to solve. But then you need to take a step back and look at your own strategy and look at how you can embed this impact consideration in your strategy. You have to look at your management processes and see whether they, within the management processes, you have key points in which you think about impact. And it's from the selection of the investees, or in case of an enterprise, of course, from the selection of your business lines, all the way through the exit of an investment, if you're an investor, that you really have to think, okay, how does impact come in at these stages? Then the third main area is transparency. You need to be transparent, and not just about these numbers that you collect and that you report on, because indicators are important, we all agree on that, but also on how you got to those indicators. What are the limitations? What are the issues that you're facing? Because otherwise, numbers without an explanation are just numbers. And I think Smita and Ruchi made the point that in different contexts, you will need different indicators, you will need to track different things, and you will also need to look at the systemic impact that you're generating. So it's beyond that simple number crunching. And last but not least, you need a very strong governance system through which, again, impact permeates the whole organization. And it's not just the impact analyst that is looking at the data, but it can really escalate to the board level so that every decision that is made is looking at impact with this lens of real sustainability, which is not just financial materiality, but it's also materiality for the stakeholders. And this journey is extremely interesting, but it's also extremely difficult, because on one side you have investors that were born this with in their DNA, others that have to start from scratch, and companies that really have to readapt. I don't know if this is a story that also is famous in your context, but in France, where the OECD is based, it was very much discussed when the CEO of Danone was asked to take a step back by the shareholders, because they didn't see the short-term results coming in as before. And this is because Emmanuel Faber, he was really trying to push the company more towards sustainability. So to the point that I think Ruchi made earlier, we also need to understand that this is a long journey, that companies and investors have to change their mindset and realize that they're in for the long haul. But once we make that change, once investors and companies make that mind shift, that culture shift, and they change the internal incentives, I think we can finally really reach a point where the regulations that we are developing will even become not necessary, because this will be so embedded in the systems that it will completely change the world. But I think we still need a little bit of time before we get there.
Yeah, you described it very beautifully, Priscilla. And yeah, Smita, Ruchi, if anyone wants to jump in the discussion, please feel free. I think you rightly mentioned, one of the key things that you mentioned at the start of your response was the transparency issue. When you say ESG rating, what it is really, when you unpack it, what does it really mean? And another is when you actually say that this is a sustainability fund, what are you really doing with it? What is the impact? A lot of these discussions, and like you said, people deserve to know what their money is doing. People deserve to have that transparency. And I think once that steps in, once that becomes mandatory in some form for people to disclose that what they're doing with the sustainability fund, and if they start learning how to really disclose that, put that information out for the users, I think that will help a lot of people to understand and question the right and the wrong, and give them the power to actually close the gap between so much funds coming in, but the impact not being seen. Yeah, and also, as we were talking about the metrics and stuff, I do think that SDGs are a very comprehensive and beautiful framework. What I like about them is that they could be a very good pointer, and they could be a very good, pointing to the north. It shows us where we are headed to. But at the end of the day, you have to have your own business process metrics right before you have to see really from the very start of the sourcing to the end distribution channel, which process is there, which one has the potential to adopt sustainability. And only then, when you can actually bring in those details into your business and start looking at business specific metrics, that can you go back and say, okay, now I'm making progress on these SDGs. So it's a two-way traffic, I believe. Thank you so much, Priscilla, on those thoughts. Maybe very quick follow-up question to that, Priscilla. I just wanted to understand from personal benefiters, do you also have any exclusionary screening based on any of the criteria? Do you say that these are a big no's for investments? We don't want the world to invest anymore into these.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the EU taxonomy that I was mentioning, that's really very clear in that respect. So I think in terms of the existing regulation, that is probably the most clear assessment of what we want to get away from. And also, I must say that in the development context, most of the organizations we work with, which are like development finance institutions, but also other types of investors, multilateral investors like the International Finance Corporation, that is part of the World Bank, they all have very, very clear exclusion criteria. So even before they select investments based on ESG, for example, or other targets, they start by saying, okay, these are sectors that we completely exclude. Now, having said this, I think what's also very important, and I think was also mentioned by other panelists, is that one approach, of course, is excluding certain sectors which we know are sort of not have a chance of recovery. Another issue, especially in developing countries, is supporting companies that are working in certain sectors towards a transition. And I think this is the approach that is very much taken by many DFIs, so development finance institutions and multilateral development banks, is to take, but also some impact investors, is really to take certain companies in certain sectors and help them through this transition, whether it's a green transition or it's a social transition, improving the conditions of employees, improving the value chains they're part of, and so on and so forth. This is also an approach that is very, very clear and very, very positive, because we can't really just, especially again in developing countries, if we want to ensure what we call a just transition, we cannot just exclude completely certain sectors and say, okay, fine, as of today, it's only green. We also have to do those sort of brown investments and help them move towards more sustainable practices, whether it's environmental or social. I hope that answers your question.
No, absolutely. In fact, that was a debate and discussion we were having recently, is that when you say that there will be no conventional source for power, it's difficult for a developing nation, and maybe in some developed nation also we see some states struggle with straight away headed towards being solar. I mean, you just cannot snip it off and say that, okay, power cut from today, now from tomorrow everybody goes solar. So there is a transition that has to happen. And yes, you rightly pointed out that. So, okay, good there. So I'm going to come to you, Smita, now. I have a very, again, much like the fund sizes discussion with Priscilla, I wanted to speak to you about this. The sustainable debt market, I mean, the green bonds, you want to call them social bonds, you want to call them sustainability bonds, they have actually reached a cumulative of $1.7 trillion US dollars at the end of 2020. Now, what I also understand is that a lot of this could actually maybe this money could make way towards the climate tech clean energy initiatives. So I want to hear from you that are any of these instruments your favorite that really truly support climate and clean energy, or how do you how do you see the space actively adopting them, and do they actually do they really bring in that value as we presume that they should be?
Sorry, I lost a little bit of network. I was trying to switch towards the end of your question. The second half of your question.
Yeah. So one is the size of the debt that we already, size of the funds which are flowing into this space. It's already about $1.7 trillion in the debt market that has been there. So my question to you is, do you firstly see these funds coming in and making an impact in the space of climate tech and clean energy? And do you have any of these favorite, as favorite bonds, which says that, okay, these are some favorite financial instruments which genuinely make an impact in your space?
Got it. Thank you. Thank you.
Because a lot of us, we presume that way, that, oh, so much of climate bonds are happening, so something must be happening in this space.
Correct, correct. I mean, these bonds right now, they definitely are promising, right? And I think I'll take a cue from what Priscilla was sharing earlier. There are industries that will have to contribute to sustainability through these bonds, because they may not be able to transition quickly themselves, and here's hoping they transition in some way eventually, but they'll have to do a mix of maybe both, right? Trying to transition themselves but also supporting through these bonds. So they do have a future, but they do come with their own set of problems right now. They're new, they're often there are issues around frameworks, methodologies, etc. And there are, again, challenges around, the sort of processes to be followed around it, the overall understanding of it, right? So there is a future, it'll evolve. But what I see as the key to driving it is essentially industry participation. I think Priscilla hinted upon it. We have, and we're seeing that change. It has to come not from a reporting or brand building, image building kind of an approach. It has to come more from a, actually driving the decision making, part of it, knowing this is what we can directly do, and this is what we'll have to do through funding other projects, through these bonds and through other financing models, right? The stage at which we come in, which is very early stage innovation and startup ecosystem, we actually see a very healthy mix of, blended finance, where all of it is required, small ticket size grant, debt for working capital support, as well as equity investments, because without these, the early stage enterprises are not going to be demonstrating a lot of project financing capabilities, right? But overall, for the sector as a whole, very strongly, these kind of these bonds are going to have more of a stronger future in India. But industry for the power industry, steel industry, cement industry, these bigger players will have to lead from the front and drive from the front, essentially.
Absolutely. Sure. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And I wish we had more time. I really wanted to talk to Priscilla again more about the blended finance approach. But I since we are running out of time now, so I'll come to you, Ruchi, with the last question here is, are there any, so now that you have your thesis prepared, how you want to approach your investments, you have your specific sectors, you have your set of metrics ready, then you look at an investee firm, you kind of select them. But then once you're done with all your measurements, once you're, through the journey of your investments, are there any kind of certification bodies or review bodies, audit bodies, or anybody who's interested in your data? I mean, not particularly just your organization, but in general in this space, are people collecting their information for a bigger change? And are there bodies which are kind of, defining if you're doing good or not so good? Are there bodies that kind of tell you that, coming back and looking at your work?
So there are actually several industry bodies now that help investors align, with a particular type of framework for impact measurement and management. So I'll mention a few here. If some of the panel, the attendees are interested, I'd be very happy to speak offline and share a longer list that we've actually gone through and analyzed. There's obviously, there's the SDG, the 17 SDGs, but they actually have a set of what's called impact practice standards around it. So you can align yourself with those standards. There are the operating principles for impact management, or OPIM, which takes a more ESG lens towards investing. So it says, consider the ESG harms inherent or potential ESG harms for each investment. And then also goes beyond the investment duration itself, saying, how are you thinking about a responsible exit? So how are you going to, how will your enterprise or the investee continue to have impact even after perhaps you as the responsible investor have exited? And then there are several others. There's the impact management project, there's IRIS, there is PRISM, etc. And each of these frameworks, will have their own strengths and weaknesses. So before just, arbitrarily aligning with one or saying, look, everyone is aligning with this one, so I'm going to do that, we recommend that, an investor should think closely about three things or two things broadly. So one is, think, as Smita mentioned earlier, right? You have to think closely about the theory of change. What is it that you what is your theory of change? And then what is the investee's theory of change as well? So you don't want to take, as an investor, we don't take the bean counting approach where we say, look, we're just going to collect all this data so we can publish this on our website and, pat ourselves on our back. We constantly ask themselves, and this is what I would recommend other investors do too. You ask yourself, for what will I actually use this data? Because, and this is something that Priscilla mentioned, right? Unless you have, the metrics are great, but if you don't go beyond that to say, look, what am I doing with this data? Then it becomes sort of a, it's just analysis for the sake of analysis, right? It's not actually led to any change. And then, so that's at the investor level. And if you think about it from the investee level, you want to make sure that they're not just doing this as a compliance exercise, that the metrics that you're choosing are actually helping the company run their operations better. And so based on this lens, the way we think about our framework is that you have to balance rigor with practicality. So, ideally we would collect all the data in the world, but, you have to think about, look, how much precision do you need? If you're going to make a $50 million investment, by all means, have an independent evaluation, really spend time on figuring out, is this worth it? But if you're taking a small bet, where you're saying, look, I can do this, you can go with, metrics that are robust without placing this excessive reporting burden. And so that means less effort, and it also means less time. And the one other industry body that I'll just mention is the Indian Impact Investors Council. They collect data from investors and from enterprises all the time to report on the state of the Indian impact investing industry. And they've published some great studies. So if you go over to their website or would like an introduction to the IIC team, again, please let me know.
Sure. So since we only have last 3 minutes, I am going to look at quickly the audience questions. So one of the question I see which had come in early, I think they asked this question much in the start, and the question was actually for you, Smita and Ruchi, that we are in an industry that focuses on 15 of the 17 SDG goals. Would specifying the impact of every SDG be essential? If yes, then what metrics to follow to showcase the severity of the impact? But I think both of you have spoken at length about how it is not about just the SDG mapping. Yes, it is good, but look at your own business and define metrics accordingly. Unless you want to specifically add something, we can probably move to the next question here. Yeah,
I just wanted to say Ruchi's answered it in detail. I think just one thing, that SDGs become a common language. So it's just easier when you use the same terms. It's easier for you to talk about it. So pick a framework or pick a, a sort of a communication tool that makes you connect with more stakeholders. But that's all. Otherwise, it has to be, like Ruchi said, relevant to your business and your theory of change.
Thanks, Smita. And so here is another question that since we only have 2 minutes, I'm going to take this one too. And if there are any unanswered questions, please send it to us and we will probably ask the panelists to respond in person, and we'll share that response. So this question, I think I'm going to take it with you, Priscilla. This question is about, the person says, I think as we do impact assessments on infrastructure projects, we also address the SDG points. But this needs to be emphasized to developers, both when they say developers, the construction developers, both private and government. In this regard, most of the safeguard specialists are not aware how to link the SDGs to the impact assessments that are being done. This linkage has to be created in the capacity building programs so that the SDGs are addressed and we can work more appropriately on internal displacement. So I think the idea is about bringing in more awareness and understanding on the the players, the infrastructure players in the market. So is that anything you could suggest how we could take this forward?
That's a very good point. I think that's made, and I think capacity building is really key. There are a number of organizations out there that are trying really to help investors and enterprises link better their work to the specific SDGs. One that comes into my head, for example, is the Global Impact Investing Network, has the IRIS Plus database, and they try to really link all their metrics, the metrics they propose for different sectors and subsectors to different SDGs. For what concerns the OECD, I mean, we are working on what we call SDG maps. So we're really trying to link the SDGs, the work of investors to the SDGs and translate the SDGs into, let's say, metrics that are more accurate for business. But I think all of this work is important and relevant, but that can only be achieved if you do the right capacity building and you really explain to the different parties that are involved what are the issues that you're trying to tackle. And again, a good indicator cannot substitute a good theory of change. So at the end of the day, for me, the SDGs are really a clear guiding light of where are the issues and where we should all collectively be investing. And we can use them, I would use them more as a strategic tool than as a reporting tool when it comes to investors. And when it comes to governments, because the SDGs were developed for governments, that's of course a completely different story.
Excellent response, Priscilla. And I see your question. I think that is Martin Malmros. I see your question. I promise to get back to you myself on this question. I do have an answer for your query there, which says India only has 0.3% of the global oil reserves. Why is this fact not used to drive the India strategy towards renewable energy? Excellent questions. Excellent question. And I do agree India is doing, I think India is doing fairly decent on the renewable energy adoption, but yes, I'll send you a good response to this. Thank you, everyone. Thanks all the panelists. Thank you, IVCAP Ventures organization for supporting us and organizing this webinar. And before I leave, I would really like to have a quick picture with all the ladies smiling. So I'm going to print screen. I'm going to take a screenshot. So smile, everyone. 3, 2, 1. Thank you. So it was an honor to have you all. Look forward to more engagement and discussions with all of you. Everyone who attended and was with us throughout, thank you so much. We look forward to having you back on the discussions again. Thank you.
Thank you.